The screaming started before midnight. Not the sound of pain, something worse. A sound like a mind-breaking, high-pitched animal, the kind of scream that makes guards press their backs against walls because they don't want to hear it anymore but can't escape it in the stone corridors of the palace. It echoed through the women's quarters of Golestan Palace in 1847, and every princess, every concubine, every servant within those walls knew exactly what it meant. Another one was dying inside herself. The girl's name was Qajar Princess Zara, 16 years old, daughter of a Shah, granddaughter of dynasties that had ruled Persia for centuries. By dawn, she would be the wife of a man who had paid for her with 3 provinces. By midnight, she had already lost something that could never be purchased back: her mind's capacity to trust safety, to feel her own body as something separate from violation, to sleep without convulsing awake at 3 a.m. with no memory of nightmares but the knowledge that something irreversible had happened. The women who had prepared her for this night sat in the adjoining chamber, drinking tea, not looking at each other. They had done this before. They would do it again. What they had orchestrated across the past 6 months wasn't love preparation. It wasn't etiquette training. It was systematic psychological destruction disguised as tradition, and the Empire's most closely guarded secret. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe, and comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know which parts of the world are hearing these stories that were meant to stay buried forever. Because the truth doesn't belong in archives. It belongs in your ears, in your understanding, in the collective refusal to let empires erase the suffering they inflicted. This is what happened to the brides of the Persian court. This is what they feared more than death itself. And this is the ritual that broke so many young women that historians still can't agree on how many of them didn't survive it mentally intact. In the Ottoman and Qajar courts of the 18th and 19th centuries, royal daughters faced a terror that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. The preparation process, kept meticulously secret, recorded in encoded documents scattered across palace archives, was designed to do one thing: erase the girl and replace her with an instrument of compliance. By the time Zara walked toward her husband's chambers on that November night in 1847, her own will had been surgically removed. The wedding night wasn't her fear. The wedding night was inevitable. What had destroyed her were the 6 months before it. The Qajar dynasty ruled Persia from 1785 to 1925. For 140 years, they controlled an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the deserts of Balochistan to the mountains of Azerbaijan. They commissioned palaces that defied architecture, gathered treasures that bankrupted competitors, accumulated power through conquest and diplomacy. But like all empires built on dominance, the Qajars understood something fundamental about power. It requires not just force, but the complete erasure of resistance. And nowhere was this more systematically applied than to the women of the royal family. A daughter of the Shah wasn't born into privilege the way Westerners understood it. She was born into a transaction. Her body was political currency. Her marriage was state policy. Her will was irrelevant from the moment of her conception. The moment a king decided to bind himself to a military general, to secure an alliance with a neighbouring province, to reward a loyal minister, he gave his daughter to cement the deal. The girl herself had no voice in this arrangement. She learned this truth early. She learned it from watching her sisters, her cousins, her aunts disappear into palaces belonging to strange men. She learned it from the absolute certainty in every adult's voice when they said, "This is your duty." But knowledge and preparation were different things. A girl could know her fate and still be shattered when it began. Zara's appointment came on a spring afternoon in 1847. She was 14 years old. The decision had been made in a council chamber she was never permitted to enter, discussed among men she barely knew, finalized with the speed of execution. Her future husband was Mirza Hassan Khan, a military commander from a family of vast landholdings in the north. He was 43 years old. He'd been married twice before. Both previous wives had died, one from complications of childbirth, one from what palace records vaguely described as melancholy. Zara was his third wife, chosen because her blood was sufficiently royal to guarantee that any sons born would carry the legitimacy he needed for higher rank. No one explained this to her directly. She heard it from servants, from fragments of conversation between older women, from the sudden shift in how people treated her, once her engagement was announced. The polite distance increased. The rules became more rigid. Where she had enjoyed a certain freedom within the palace, the ability to move between chambers, to spend time in the gardens, to study manuscripts in the library, suddenly there were restrictions. An older eunuch followed her everywhere. She was no longer permitted to speak casually with male servants. Her clothing changed. Her schedule changed. Her entire existence seemed to narrow into a single point: preparation for the wedding night. This is where the real destruction began. The women tasked with her preparation were ancient by her measure, though some were barely 40. They had titles: the overseer of brides, the mistress of ritual, the guardian of propriety. But their function was more precise than their titles suggested. They were architects of erasure. They knew, with the precision of engineers, exactly which psychological pressures would break a young woman's capacity for autonomous thought, and they applied these pressures systematically, methodically, with the calm efficiency of someone performing a task they had perfected through repetition. The first change was her voice. Over 6 months, Zara's vocabulary was deliberately reduced. She was permitted to speak only in response to direct questions. In those responses, she was restricted to formal phrases of agreement, apology, gratitude, and request. Yes, as you wish. Forgive my inadequacy. Thank you for your kindness. With permission, may I? Anything beyond this was met with swift punishment. Not physical violence, though that came later. First, it was isolation. Speaking out of turn meant spending the rest of the day alone in her chamber. It meant being excluded from meals. It meant the other young women in the preparation. There were always others, always girls at various stages of the breaking process, would be instructed to treat her with visible disdain. The logic here was devastatingly simple and devastatingly effective. Language is the primary tool humans use to maintain a sense of continuity and identity. When you can speak your thoughts, you reinforce your sense of self. You maintain internal coherence. You remember who you are. By restricting Zara's language to 43 permitted phrases, the system wasn't just controlling her communication, it was dismantling her capacity to think complex thoughts. She couldn't articulate her fear, so the fear calcified inside her. She couldn't express her confusion, so confusion became her baseline state. She couldn't defend herself verbally, so verbal vulnerability became ingrained as normal. The other young women being trained alongside her, there were 7 of them at various points during Zara's 6 months of preparation, became a crucial part of the system. Paradoxically, their presence made everything worse. They were her only potential source of comfort, of shared experience, of someone who might understand what she was enduring, and yet they had been carefully positioned against her. When one of the girls would transgress the speaking rules, she would not only be punished, she would be blamed by the others, who had been told that non-compliance from one girl threatened all their preparations. This created a perverse dynamic where the young women were forced to police each other, to view each other not as allies but as threats. Zara watched a girl named Soraya try to comfort another girl who was clearly having a panic attack. Both were isolated immediately. Soraya was told she was undermining the other girl's necessary conditioning. The other girl was told that Soraya's sympathy was weakness. By the next day, they were barely willing to look at each other. Zara learned the lesson perfectly. Connection was dangerous. Other people couldn't be trusted. The only safe response was compliance and distance. The psychology was perfect. In a palace where she had no family close to her, where every adult had been instructed to maintain formal distance, where her only companions were other frightened girls, social exclusion became a form of psychological annihilation. Within weeks, she stopped speaking voluntarily. She answered when required. Otherwise, silence. Her mind filled the silence with increasingly dark narratives. She began to interpret every look from the older women as judgment. She heard instructions and casual comments. She became hypervigilant, scanning every interaction for evidence that she was failing some unseen test. Then, they came for her body. The movement training was unlike anything she had ever encountered. Her tutors before engagement had taught her how to move with grace, how to enter a room with elegance, how to carry herself with dignity appropriate to her station. This was something else entirely. This was the systematic destruction of her ability to move with confidence or autonomy. This was the deliberate programming of her physical being to express permanent submission. She was required to spend 3 hours each morning practicing what the older women called the 8 movements of submission. These weren't simple gestures. Each one was choreographed with obsessive precision, each designed to express a specific kind of subordination. The greeting bow, where your eyes must drop before your torso bends. The serving bow, where you lower yourself from a position of power to a position of reception. The retreat bow, where you move backward without ever turning your back, a physical impossibility that required constant correction, constant failure, constant humiliation. The angle of her neck had to be exact, tilted down at precisely 30 degrees when in the presence of authority. Not 35 degrees, which would be too submissive and suggest weakness. Not 25 degrees, which would be insufficiently deferential. Exactly 30 degrees. Her hands could never rise above her heart. Her steps had to be small, careful, uncertain, no more than the length of her own foot in each stride. She was taught to move in ways that made her physically smaller, less threatening, less likely to take up space. The goal was to train her body to express subordination at the neurological level, so that by the time she entered her husband's presence, her body would automatically assume a posture of submission before her conscious mind could even register what was happening. Hour after hour she repeated these movements. Her muscles ached. Her mind went numb. The repetitive motions created a kind of trance state that was perhaps intentional, perhaps just the natural consequence of drilling the same movements until they became automatic. The older women stood watching with the patience of people doing work they understood completely, occasionally correcting her positioning with sharp words or physical adjustment of her limbs. "Your spine. Too straight," Zainab would snarl and push Zara's back downward, forcing her into a more curved posture. "You're not broken enough. Again." Mariam would circle her like she was assessing livestock. "Your eyes too direct. Look down. Always down. What are you trying to do?" Challenge him. "Do you want to destroy this marriage before it begins?" Other corrections were paired with explicit humiliation. When Zara's step was too confident, suggesting maybe some small fragment of her own will was still intact, she would be made to repeat the movement while all the other girls were called to watch. "Look at this," Zainab would announce. "This is what happens when a bride forgets her place. This is the movement of someone too proud to understand submission. We'll need to repeat this training until she learns humility." The psychological weight of being constantly observed, constantly corrected, constantly told she was failing some invisible test. It accumulated daily. Zara began to experience her own body as a betrayal. Her muscles wouldn't hold the right position. Her neck wouldn't angle correctly. Her eyes wouldn't look down with sufficient conviction. She was failing at the one thing she was now permitted to focus on, the physical expression of her own worthlessness. What she was learning, at the deepest muscular level, was the physical grammar of powerlessness. The body, if trained repetitively enough, internalizes the messages it's forced to perform. Studies of trauma survivors show that the body remembers coercion in ways the mind sometimes tries to forget. Muscles develop patterns of tension, of withdrawal. The autonomic nervous system learns to enter states of submission. By training her body to move in these specific ways, the system wasn't just teaching her how to behave, it was literally rewriting her at the neurological level. By the time 6 months had passed, her body had internalized a complete message. You do not control yourself. Your movements are not your own. Your space is borrowed. And worse, this message was so thoroughly ingrained that it became automatic. She could be alone in her chamber and still find herself moving in these small, submissive ways. She would catch herself tilting her head down even when no one was watching. Her body was becoming her enemy, expressing subjugation even when she wasn't consciously choosing it. The psychological disassembly ran parallel to the physical conditioning. The women introduced a concept they called the testing. This was presented as preparation for her husband's expectations, but its real function was to install absolute dread, to create a permanent state of hypervigilance, to ensure that even in moments of supposed safety, Zara's nervous system was firing an alarm. The testing consisted of elaborate scenarios in which older women would role-play situations that Zara would allegedly face on her wedding night and beyond. An older woman, usually the stern, cold mistress, mistress named Zainab, who seemed to take genuine pleasure in the work, would position herself as the husband. But Zainab wasn't performing the husband as kind or reasonable. She was performing him as capriciously cruel, unpredictably angry, impossible to satisfy. Zara would be instructed to approach her, greet her appropriately, perform gestures of deference and obedience. She would do everything exactly as she had been taught, and then, without any variation in Zara's performance to justify it, without any logical reason, the simulation would turn cruel. Zainab's face would harden. Her voice would become ice. "You did that wrong," Zainab would snarl. "I've seen peasants with more grace. Your future husband will be so displeased he might cast you aside. What will you do then? Go back to your family in shame? That's the kind of thing that ends in..." And here she would pause, letting Zara's imagination complete the threat. Or, "You're too slow, too stupid, too awkward. What good is a wife who can't even learn to position herself correctly? Why would Hassan Khan want you when he could have any woman in Persia?" Sometimes the cruelty was more elaborate. Zainab would deliberately perform the action Zara was supposed to be greeting incorrectly, and then blame Zara for not responding to the error in exactly the right way. "You should have known I was doing that wrong. A good wife would have intuited my needs and corrected for my mistakes. You just stood there like an idiot while I humiliated myself." The worst variation, the one that truly shattered something in Zara, was the silent treatment. Zainab would suddenly act as though Zara no longer existed. She would turn away, would speak only to other women about Zara's inadequacy, treating her as though her presence had become physically offensive. "I can barely look at her anymore," Zainab would say as if Zara wasn't in the room. "The way she moved just now, so clumsy. Hassan Khan will be so disappointed. Poor man, his bride will be such a burden." And the other women would nod in agreement, their silence indicating that they too had lost interest in Zara as a human being. These moments of total social erasure, of being in the presence of other people and having them collectively decide you no longer exist, they cause something close to psychological death. Humans are social beings. Social connection is as fundamental as food or water. Social erasure is a form of torture that leaves no marks. Each testing scenario was designed to trigger a specific psychological response, and the system ensured that every possible response from Zara was wrong. If she tried harder, she was trying too hard and revealing her desperation. If she remained calm, she was being cold and not sufficiently invested in her marital success. If she apologized for failures, she was self-pitying. If she accepted criticism without complaint, she was accepting it too readily and wasn't genuinely trying. There was no combination of actions that would result in approval. The system itself was designed to be impossible to succeed at. This created a psychological trap that is well understood in trauma literature: learned helplessness. When a person is placed in a situation where no response leads to positive outcome, where everything they try fails, where punishment is random and disconnected from their actions, eventually their brain learns that effort is useless. They stop trying. They stop fighting. They internalize the belief that they cannot control their environment or their outcomes. This is called learned helplessness, and it's one of the most reliable ways to break a person's will. The testing happened randomly, at unpredictable moments, which intensified the psychological impact. Zara could be pulled aside during a meal, could be interrupted during her brief study time, could be confronted while walking through corridors. The uncertainty itself became a weapon. Her nervous system was trained not to relax. She couldn't know when she was safe because the system ensured that nowhere was safe. The punishment was random enough that it didn't matter whether she performed correctly or incorrectly. The outcome was always unpredictable, always potentially devastating. She learned to exist in a state of low-level terror, a state of permanent vigilance where her heart rate was always slightly elevated, where her muscles were always slightly tense, where part of her mind was always scanning for the next threat. By month 3 of preparation, her body had adapted to this state, and she stopped sleeping normally. She would lie awake for hours, her mind racing with scenarios, with fears, with what-ifs. When she did sleep, it was fitful, broken by nightmares she couldn't remember upon waking, but whose emotional residue, pure terror, pure shame, lingered throughout the next day. She would wake at 3 a.m. in a state of panic, her heart racing so fast she thought it would explode, her breath coming in gasps, her entire body drenched in sweat. She had no clear memory of what had triggered the panic attack. No specific dream or thought preceded it. It was just her nervous system firing an alarm, doing exactly what it had been trained to do. Her body was now a threat to itself. The older women noticed this sleep deprivation and the panic attacks, and they praised it as progress. She's beginning to understand, they told each other in conversations Zara could hear but was not permitted to interrupt. She's developing the proper anxiety, the proper fear. Hassan Khan will find her very manageable. The lack of sleep itself became another weapon. Sleep deprivation is recognized as a form of torture. It degrades cognitive function, impairs emotional regulation, intensifies anxiety, and creates a state of psychological fragility where the victim is far more susceptible to suggestion and coercion. By depriving Zara of sleep through the induced state of permanent terror, the system was further dismantling her cognitive and emotional resilience. Then came the medical component, and Zara's final fragmentation accelerated. Every week she was examined by an elderly physician named Dr. Mirza Baram, who had served the palace for 30 years and had examined probably 100 young women preparing for marriages. His examinations were conducted with clinical precision and absolute invasiveness, the kind of precise detachment that comes from repetition, from treating human beings as objects to be evaluated and documented. He would check her for any physical defects that might make her unsuitable as a bride. He tested her flexibility, sometimes pushing her limbs beyond their normal range, creating small pains that she was instructed to bear without complaint. He took measurements of her body, her height, her arm span, the circumference of her hips, the size of her chest. Measurements that would be recorded in medical charts that still exist in palace archives and that are deeply disturbing to read because they quantify a human being in precisely the way one might quantify livestock being evaluated for breeding. He examined her in ways that violated every boundary she had, in ways that made absolutely clear that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state, to her future husband, to the men who had decided her value based on her reproductive capacity. The examinations included internal examinations that were ostensibly to check her readiness for marriage, though what exactly this entailed was unclear and deliberately shrouded in medical language that obscured more than it revealed. The worst part of these examinations was their randomness and their unpredictability. Zara would be brought to the examination room at different times of day, sometimes after she'd eaten, sometimes while she was fasting, sometimes in the morning and sometimes in the evening. Different servants would assist, different rooms would be used. The inconsistency meant that she couldn't prepare herself mentally, couldn't create any kind of routine or ritual that would help her process what was happening. Each examination felt like a fresh violation. The examinations were presented as medical necessity, pure objective assessment. But their psychological function was identical to the physical training and the testing. They were teaching her that her body could be accessed without her consent, that her discomfort was irrelevant, that her physical autonomy was an illusion she needed to surrender. They were installing at the deepest level the message that she was a thing to be inspected, evaluated, used. After these examinations, she would sit in her chamber and dissociate in ways that were becoming increasingly severe. She would stare at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. She would sometimes touch her own skin and feel disconnected from the sensation, as though there was a layer of glass between her mind and her body, a space that couldn't be crossed, a separation that would in many ways become permanent. This dissociation is one of the mind's most powerful survival mechanisms. When experience becomes unbearable, consciousness removes itself. It observes from a distance. It separates from the body that is being violated. It's an ingenious mechanism that allows people to survive things that should break them. But it comes with a permanent cost. The person who emerges from the dissociative state is never quite the same. They have survived, yes, but they have done so by fragmenting their own consciousness. Bringing the fragments back together afterward is often impossible. The preparation also included extensive instruction in the proper response to marital relations. This was handled in coded language, deliberately obscure instructions delivered by an older woman named Soraya, who had been the wife of a provincial governor and was now retained as a kind of tutor in compliance. The instructions were vague, which was perhaps intentional. The vagueness created space for Zara to fill in the worst possible interpretations. Soraya would speak in abstract terms about a husband's needs and a wife's obligation and the importance of never refusing. She would describe scenarios in clinical detail, how to position herself, how to remain still, how to make no sound. Your pleasure is irrelevant, Soraya said with absolute flatness. Your preference is irrelevant. Your comfort is irrelevant. These concepts do not apply to you. You exist to serve. That is all. Zara was given no explanation of what would actually occur. No accurate information about her own body or her husband's. Just instructions on how to be passive, how to be accepting, how to pretend that everything happening to her was fine. This combination of vagueness and instruction created a perfect psychological trap. Her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. The fear her imagination generated was probably worse than any reality could have been, and the older women knew this. They encouraged the fear. They added to it through their cryptic warnings about what happens if a wife is unprepared. By month 5, Zara had begun to experience what modern psychology would recognize as depersonalization. She would sometimes find herself watching her own actions from outside her body, observing herself move through her day as though she were a character in a story rather than a living person. She would hear her own voice, those carefully restricted formal phrases, as though someone else was speaking. The breakdown came in the final week before her wedding. She was brought to a private chamber and shown a series of objects she had never seen before, sexual instruments, items whose purposes she didn't understand but which clearly existed for purposes she was being encouraged to fear. The older woman presenting these items, it was Zainab again, that cold master of psychological. Devastation described them without emotional inflection, just facts delivered in a voice like a catalogue. Your husband may wish to use these. You will not object. You will not resist. You will not feel pain because you will have learned not to feel. Zara felt something break inside her during that conversation. Not in a metaphorical way. There was an actual sensation of internal shattering, a moment where she could feel her mind's capacity to protect itself simply shut down. She began to have panic attacks. They would come without warning. Her heart would accelerate to a speed that made her think she was dying. Her breath would come in gasps, her vision would blur. The physician was called. He gave her a sedative, some kind of opiate preparation that would be administered regularly from that point forward. The sedatives made her numb, less able to feel terror, but also less able to feel anything. She existed in a fog, moving through her final days of preparation with a kind of dumb compliance that the older women took as success. Her wedding day arrived on a November morning when the sky was grey and the wind carried the promise of winter. She was dressed by servants. They moved efficiently, not speaking to her, treating her body like an object to be wrapped and prepared. The wedding dress was extraordinarily beautiful. White silk embroidered with gold thread, so heavy she could barely stand. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that took 4 hours. Her face was painted with cosmetics that made her look like a porcelain doll, beautiful and lifeless. She was given jewellery that had belonged to previous wives, including some that had belonged to Hassan Khan's second wife, the one who had died of melancholy. No one mentioned this connection to her, but she heard it from servants. Everything about her preparation that day seemed designed to whisper the message: you are disposable. You are replaceable. What happens to you matters less than what you represent. The ceremony itself was mercifully brief. She was brought before a mullah, her proxy. An older male relative she barely knew stood in for her consent. She was asked if she agreed, and when she didn't respond, a servant nudged her, and she made some sound that was interpreted as assent. The words were recited, the contract was signed. She was now the wife of Hassan Khan. The celebration lasted 6 hours. She sat motionless on a cushioned throne while hundreds of people filed past, congratulating her, offering blessings, eating food, celebrating a union she had not chosen. She remembered very little of it. The sedatives had kept her in a state of functional dissociation. She could see and hear what was happening around her, but she couldn't quite connect to it emotionally. As evening fell, the women began preparing her for the wedding night. She was bathed by servants in water that smelled of rose petals and perfumes. She was dressed in a thin silk gown that left her, barely covered. Her hair was arranged loose down her back, a signal of maiden status. She was given another sedative, something stronger than before. Then she was led to the bridal chamber by the overseer of brides, an ancient woman named Mariam, whose face looked like a dried apple, and whose eyes never held any emotion whatsoever. The chamber was prepared with enormous care. The walls were draped in red silk. There were candles everywhere, casting a warm glow that was somehow obscene in its beauty. On the bed was the finest linen, white and pristine. Everything about the room was designed to look welcoming, almost seductive, a careful contradiction to the terror that Zara carried in her chest. Mariam positioned her on the bed. "Stay here," she said. "He will come. You will do as you have been taught. You will not resist. You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will not cry." Then she turned and left, and Zara heard the sound of the door being locked from the outside. She sat in that chamber, in that beautiful room, with every nerve in her body screaming. The sedatives made her foggy, but not foggy enough to prevent her from understanding what was about to happen. She tried to think, to prepare herself, but her mind had been so thoroughly dismantled over 6 months that she couldn't find any intact pieces. She couldn't find any part of herself that knew how to survive this. When Hassan Khan entered the chamber an hour later, he was partially drunk. He didn't greet her. He didn't speak to her. He simply began to remove his clothing. She watched this happening as though from behind glass. The sedatives had separated her consciousness from her body so effectively that she could observe herself being touched without quite feeling it. She lay where she'd been positioned. She made no sound. She did not resist. She had been trained too well for that. What lasted perhaps 20 minutes felt like hours. When it was finished, he dressed and left without speaking to her. She remained on the bed, still dissociated, still foggy, her body not quite her own. The older women came into the chamber while it was still dark. They checked the sheets for evidence of blood, the physical proof of her virginity. Finding what they needed to find, they departed, satisfied that the transaction had been completed successfully. And then something inside Zara broke that had already been broken, shattered in a way that left her unable to fully repair. The screaming that echoed through the palace that night, that sound that terrified the servants and made the guards look away, that was the sound of her mind finally giving way. Not to the wedding night itself, that had been survivable through dissociation. The screaming was the moment her dissociation itself failed, the moment she suddenly re-inhabited her body fully and felt everything. 6 months of accumulated terror, violation, erasure, the physical and psychological destruction of everything. She had been, all at once. By morning the physicians were called. They administered heavy doses of sedatives. Within days she entered a kind of permanent fog. She complied with everything asked of her. She bore her husband a son within the year. She bore 3 more children over the following 8 years. She performed her duties as a wife with exemplary obedience. She was, by every official measure, a perfect success. But the girl who had once loved to read poetry, who had a mind sharp enough to understand complex philosophical texts, who had asked questions that astounded her tutors, that girl was gone. In her place was a woman who moved through life like a ghost, who answered only when spoken to, who seemed only partially present even when looking directly at someone. She lived for 37 more years. She died at 53, the official cause recorded as a wasting illness, though the palace physicians noted in private correspondence that she had simply seemed to give up, as though her body, having absorbed so much trauma, finally decided existence was too exhausting to continue. What happened to Zara wasn't unique. Across the century and a half of Qajar rule, this same ritual repeated itself. Dozens of royal daughters underwent some variation of this process. The preparation protocols varied slightly depending on the age of the bride and the status of her future husband, but the core principle remained identical. Break the girl's will, erase her autonomy, install submission at the neurological level, then deliver her to her husband as a perfectly compliant instrument. We know the names of many of these women, and their stories follow predictable patterns. There was Princess Ashraf, married at age 15 in 1823, whose personal diary, discovered in palace archives in 2003, documents in increasingly incoherent handwriting her progressive psychological collapse during preparation. By month 4, her entries become disconnected, jumping between disconnected phrases, "not myself," "always watched," "can't remember why I moved this way," "when did my body stop being mine?" By month 6, the entries stop entirely. Princess Fatima, married in 1856, reportedly attempted to hide in the palace gardens to avoid her husband's chambers on her wedding night. She was found after several hours in a state of complete catatonia. The physician's records describe her as unresponsive to stimuli, pupils fixed, vital signs barely detectable. She recovered partially over the following weeks but was never the same, never fully returned to conscious engagement with the world. Princess Nosrat, married in 1841, is documented in correspondence between her older sister and a trusted aunt as having lost all capacity for independent thought after her preparation. The letter describes Nosrat as moving through the palace like a doll manipulated by invisible strings, speaking only when spoken to, seeming unaware of her surroundings. These weren't rare cases. They were the norm. The preparation was designed to produce exactly this outcome. The Empire wasn't trying to accidentally break these women. It was systematically breaking them intentionally, and the consistency with which this worked suggests the system operators understood exactly what they were doing at a neurological and psychological level. Historical records from this period are sparse in some ways, but disturbingly detailed in others. The Qajars, unlike the Ottomans, left fewer official documents about their palace practices, but what survives in scattered letters, in the coded journals of physicians, in the fragmentary testimonies recorded by female family members, in letters from sisters to sisters describing what they witnessed, in the later accounts of elderly women dictating their experiences to researchers, what survives tells a profoundly consistent story. The brides feared the preparation more than the wedding night itself. The psychological destruction was intentional. The Empire understood that a young woman's fear could be weaponized, that the anticipation of violation was often more damaging than the violation itself. The palace physicians who recorded their observations seemed to understand on some level what was happening, even if they used clinical language to obscure it. One doctor's journal from 1834 describes a bride 4 weeks into preparation in terms that, translated from the formal Persian medical language, amount to: patient exhibits signs of systematic psychological breakdown, dissociation, persistent anxiety, sleep deprivation, diminished autonomic self-regulation, appropriate for her intended purpose. That phrase, appropriate for her intended purpose, reveals something crucial. The physicians weren't trying to heal these women. They were monitoring the effectiveness of their psychological destruction. They were measuring success in terms of how thoroughly the woman had been broken. Some of the princesses attempted to resist. There are scattered accounts of girls who refused to cooperate with their preparation, who spoke when they weren't permitted to, who tried to maintain some fragment of their autonomy in the face of a system designed to erase it entirely. Their resistance is perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this history, because it documents not the success of the system, but the profound psychological strength required to fight it, and how that strength was ultimately broken through systematic means. One princess, whose name appears only as sus in surviving documents, reportedly refused to perform the 8 movements of submission, claiming that such physical degradation was incompatible with royal dignity. She was not beaten. Instead, she was isolated completely. All her meals were brought to her in her sealed chamber. All other people were instructed to ignore her completely. Servants would not look at her, speak to her, or acknowledge her existence in any way. She existed in a state of complete social death while still physically alive. After 3 weeks of this treatment, she began to perform the movements perfectly. When asked why she suddenly cooperated, she reportedly said, "Because I no longer exist. I cannot refuse what a ghost cannot do." Another girl, Princess Mariam, attempted to befriend a servant girl who had shown her kindness. Both were immediately separated. Mariam was told the servant girl had died. Whether this was true or a calculated psychological manipulation is unclear from the historical record. But the effect was clear. Mariam learned that attempting connection resulted in the destruction of the connection. She never again attempted to form any relationship. A third princess, whose preparation occurred in 1867, allegedly tried to hide books in her chamber. She had been an intellectual before her engagement, loved literature and philosophy, and was trying to maintain that part of herself. The books were discovered and burned in front of her. She was told that her intellectual interests were the source of her disobedience, her refusal to properly accept her place. Reading was presented as a kind of mental disease that the preparation was meant to cure. After that, she never read again. One princess was reportedly kept in a locked chamber for 17 years after her wedding night, after she became what the palace records describe as unmanageable, following what seems to have been a complete psychotic break. We don't know what happened to her. We don't have records of her life after that. She disappeared from documentation, which in some ways may have been merciful. It meant she no longer had to perform the role of compliant wife. But it also meant she was lost to history, her suffering completely erased. The Empire justified this system through multiple layers of narrative, each one designed to obscure what was actually happening. It was presented as necessary for social stability. Royal wives had to be absolutely obedient, or they would destabilize the political structures their marriages were meant to secure. It was framed as protective. This was the only way to ensure a girl wouldn't be destroyed by the shock of womanhood, the sudden loss of protection that came with leaving her family home. It was described as traditional, as simply the way things had always been done, as though historical precedent somehow justified systematically destroying the minds of young women. None of these justifications withstand scrutiny. They were and are rationalizations offered by people who had committed or were about to commit tremendous harm. They were ways of looking away, ways of pretending that deliberate psychological torture was something else, something more acceptable, something that could be named with euphemistic language and therefore rendered invisible. The women who administered this system, the overseers of brides, the mistresses of ritual, the guardians of propriety, they were not monsters in any conventional sense. Most of them had been through the preparation themselves decades before. They had survived it by internalizing its logic, by telling themselves that what had happened to them was normal, necessary, even protective. By becoming the administrators of trauma rather than its victims, they found a way to maintain the illusion that they had power and agency. The truth, which they couldn't have articulated but on some level understood, was that they were reproducing the systems that had victimized them, passing the breaking down to the next generation, and that in doing so they were perpetuating their own original trauma. Understanding the Qajar bride preparation isn't an exercise in feeling superior to the past, in congratulating ourselves on how far we've come. It's an exercise in recognizing patterns that are still active, still dangerous, still destroying people today. The difference is that now we have language for what's happening. We can identify it. We can name it. We can point at systems using these techniques and say, this is psychological torture. This is coercive control. This is unacceptable. And that naming is the first step toward refusing to let it happen again, toward building systems and communities where this kind of destruction is recognized immediately and stopped. The Qajar technique of destroying autonomy through purely psychological means became the template for a century of abuse. These mechanisms were studied, adopted, and refined by intelligence agencies conducting interrogations. They were adapted by cults designed to break down recruits. They were refined in psychology laboratories studying coercive control. They are currently being used in intimate relationships, in abusive families, in authoritarian regimes. The knowledge that the Qajars accumulated, the understanding of how completely you could destroy someone's will without leaving marks, that knowledge escaped the palace. It spread. It multiplied. It became a blueprint for control. That is why this history matters. That is why we need to know what happened to Zara and all the other princesses, not as an artifact of a distant past, but as recognition of techniques that never really stopped being used, as a warning about what systems are capable of when they decide that breaking a human being is acceptable policy. Zara died in 1884, 53 years old, her death barely noted by the palace or by subsequent historians. A brief entry in palace records. The wife of Hassan Khan passed after a prolonged illness. She bore 4 children, all surviving. Her tomb was constructed in accordance with custom. That was all. The brilliant young woman who had loved to study and read poetry, who had asked profound questions about astronomy and history, who had filled journals with observations and sketches and ideas, that woman was replaced by a ghost who moved through the world with dissociated compliance for nearly 4 decades. Her children were successful by imperial measure. Her eldest son became a government official of some prominence. Her daughters married other officials and continued the cycle. Her husband eventually took 2 more wives and fathered children with them as well. By the metrics the empire used to measure success, the marriage had been a triumph. It had served its political purpose perfectly. It had produced heirs. It had bound Hassan Khan more firmly to the throne. It had done everything it was supposed to do. But in the decades after her death, women who had known her, her sisters, her cousins, elderly servants who had worked in the palace, occasionally remarked on the tragedy of it to those they trusted. not the tragedy of having been married off for political reasons. They lived in a world where this was assumed as normal, as inevitable, as the price of being born female and royal. The tragedy they articulated was something else entirely. Something fundamental in Zara had died, they said, long before her body stopped functioning. They remembered the girl she had been before the preparation. They spoke in hushed and careful language about how completely different she became, how present she was before and how absent afterward. How it was as though someone had performed a kind of internal surgery on her consciousness, removing the parts that made her a person and leaving only the parts that made her useful. They understood, without the vocabulary to articulate it in modern psychological terms, that something systematic had been done to her, something deliberately designed, something that had nothing to do with love, tradition, or even practical marriage preparation, something that had everything to do with power, the power to take a human being and reshape her completely, to erase who she was and construct someone new in her place, to do this so thoroughly that even she wouldn't quite be able to remember the original version of herself. It took historians in the late 20th century to give that intuitive understanding structure and evidence. It took the painstaking work of piecing together scattered documents, the careful interviews with survivors and descendants of survivors, the cross-referencing with contemporary psychological understanding of trauma to confirm what some had always sensed on some level. The Qajar preparation of brides wasn't an unfortunate consequence of patriarchy. It wasn't a sad side effect of traditional marriage practices. It was patriarchal power operating at maximum efficiency, reaching into the minds of young women and systematically dismantling their capacity for autonomous thought, and doing so with such precision that the destruction was nearly invisible. The empire understood psychology before it had a name. The palace operators understood what we now call learned helplessness, dissociation, coercive control, psychological trauma. They understood it not through formal education or theoretical study, but through practical application. Generations of trial and error, observation of what worked and what didn't, refinement of techniques that produced the desired psychological state. This knowledge, accumulated through the systematic destruction of dozens of young women, was never written down in any place where it could be formally studied or taught. It was transmitted woman to woman, from the older women who administered the preparation to the younger women who would eventually become administrators themselves. It was oral tradition in the worst sense, a knowledge transfer that perpetuated suffering. It took historians in the late 20th century to give that understanding structure and evidence. It took the piecing together of scattered documents, the interviews with survivors, the cross-referencing with psychological understanding of trauma to confirm what some had always sensed. The Qajar preparation of brides wasn't an unfortunate consequence of patriarchy. It was patriarchal power operating at maximum efficiency, reaching into the minds of young women and systematically dismantling their capacity for autonomous thought. And what makes this history matter now isn't just that it happened, it's that the mechanisms they used, the isolation, the surveillance, the control of speech, the random punishment, the installation of hypervigilance, the repeated violations of physical autonomy, the deliberate creation of trauma, these aren't historical curiosities. These are the mechanisms of coercive control that still operate in the world today. They're used by abusers in intimate relationships. They're used by cults. They're used by certain states against their own populations. The Qajars didn't invent these mechanisms, but they did refine them. They did systematize them. They proved that it was possible to completely break a person's will through purely psychological means. What makes this history matter now isn't just that it happened, it's that the mechanisms they used, the isolation, the surveillance, the control of speech, the random punishment, the installation of hypervigilance, the repeated violations of physical autonomy, the deliberate creation of trauma, these aren't historical curiosities. These are the mechanisms of coercive control that still operate in the world today. They're used by abusers in intimate relationships. They're used by cults to break down new members. They're used by certain states against their own populations. They're used in psychological warfare. The Qajars didn't invent these mechanisms, they didn't create coercive control or psychological trauma as tools of power. But they did refine them. They did systematize them with remarkable precision. They proved empirically that it was possible to completely break a person's will through purely psychological means, without the inefficiency of physical violence, without leaving marks, without creating the kind of evidence that becomes embarrassing for an empire to explain. That knowledge, that understanding of how completely you could destroy someone's autonomy without leaving bruises, that's the dangerous inheritance of this history. It's knowledge that travels, it spreads, it gets used. The techniques developed in palace chambers in 19th century Persia were used by intelligence agencies in 20th century interrogations. They were adapted and refined by people who had studied trauma and understood psychology. They became the blueprint for what we now call psychological torture, and what the torture resistance community identifies in high control groups and abusive relationships. Understanding the Qajar bride preparation isn't an exercise in appreciating how far we've come. It's an exercise in recognizing patterns that are still active, still dangerous, still destroying people. The difference is that now we have language for what's happening. We can identify it, we can name it, and that naming is the first step toward refusing to let it happen again. The most disturbing aspect of this history is how thoroughly it worked. Most of the brides who underwent preparation did become exactly what the system intended them to become: compliant, obedient, unable to assert their own needs or preferences, psychologically trapped in patterns of submission, so deeply ingrained they couldn't even recognize them as chains. They raised children in those patterns. They passed down the trauma, often to their own daughters. The system perpetuated itself through multiple generations because its victims became, in many cases, its administrators. A girl who had been broken could, if she survived, become one of the women who would break the next generation of girls. Trauma as inheritance, abuse as tradition. What happened to these women wasn't love. It wasn't preparation in any honest sense. It wasn't tradition in any meaningful sense. It was carefully designed psychological torture administered by the state, with the full knowledge of what it was doing, to ensure absolute compliance, and it remained hidden for more than 100 years, not because evidence didn't exist, but because the women who survived it often couldn't speak about it, because the empire had structured the trauma in such a way that the victims themselves had been psychologically trained to defend the system that had destroyed them. If this history has disturbed you, and it absolutely should, then please subscribe to this channel, because the archives of history are absolutely full of these stories. Stories that empires tried to bury beneath layers of bureaucratic language and official silence. Stories that women survived and passed down despite the systems deliberately designed to erase them. Stories that matter. And in the comments, tell me, which other hidden royal histories do you want exposed? Which women whose suffering has been deliberately buried by official narratives do you want to hear about? Which stories have empires tried to keep locked, away? Because these stories don't belong gathering dust in archives behind locked doors. They belong in the collective consciousness. They belong in spaces like this where we can acknowledge them, honor them, refuse to let them disappear into the silence that empires prefer. Where are you listening from? I want to know that this truth is reaching across oceans and borders, that people everywhere are learning what their empires tried to hide. That's what makes this story matter. Not that it happened centuries ago, but that knowing it happened changes how we understand power, trauma, and the systematic destruction of autonomous will. It changes how we recognize these patterns when we see them operating today. The story of the Qajar brides is a reminder that history isn't finished with us. It echoes forward through time. It teaches us what systems are capable of when they put their full force toward the destruction of human beings. And it reminds us that the most effective violence is often the kind that leaves no marks, the kind that happens inside someone's mind, the kind that an empire can carefully hide for 100 years until patient researchers finally pull back the curtain. Understanding the Qajar bride preparation isn't an exercise in feeling superior to the past and congratulating ourselves on how far we've come. It's an exercise in recognizing patterns that are still active, still dangerous, still destroying people today. The difference is that now we have language for what's happening. We can identify it, we can name it, we can point at systems using these techniques and say, this is psychological torture, this is coercive control, this is unacceptable. And that naming is the first step toward refusing to let it happen again, toward building systems and communities where this kind of destruction is recognized immediately and stopped. The Qajar technique of destroying autonomy through purely psychological means became the template for a century of abuse. These mechanisms were studied, adopted, and refined by intelligence agencies conducting interrogations. They were adapted by cults designed to break down recruits. They were refined in psychology laboratories studying coercive control. They are currently being used in intimate relationships, in abusive families, in authoritarian regimes. The knowledge that the Qajars accumulated, the understanding of how completely you could destroy someone's will without leaving marks, that knowledge escaped the palace. It spread, it multiplied, it became a blueprint for control that continues to be used against vulnerable people every single day. That is why this history matters profoundly. That is why we need to know what happened to Zara and all the other princesses, not as an artifact of a distant past, but as recognition of techniques that never really stopped being used, as a warning about what systems are capable of when they decide that breaking a human being is acceptable policy, as proof that psychological destruction can be perfected, systematized, and handed down through generations. Until next time, remember this: the official story is rarely the true story. The history they teach in schools has been edited for comfort, simplified for easy consumption, stripped of the complexity and horror that makes it real. What we're doing here is reading the unedited version, the version that empires didn't want written. And that's where the real understanding begins. Not in the comfortable narratives, but in the difficult truths that challenge everything we thought we knew about power, tradition, and human resilience.